Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and founder of Tortoise, and for more than a year now, we've been hosting these webinars with the CBI, trying to understand the ways in which we are changing and accommodating the new expectations of life, the new demands on business, the changing ways in which the government is looking to all of us to accommodate the coronavirus and the many changes and challenges that come from it. And this morning, the focus of our conversation is actually the continuing change as more of the economy opens up in our ways of working. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Rebecca Weston, who's the COO at Sellafield. I'm really aware, Rebecca, that so often people have these conversations about ways of working as if there's a complete assumption that everyone works in exactly the same way that they do. So I can pretty much guess that lots of us don't work in the ways that you do. So I look forward to hearing from you. Alexander Barkley runs strategic design at BCG, at Boston Consulting Group, and so is particularly well placed to think about the way businesses are organized, the big trends that we're seeing in the way in which people work. And we're joined by Matthew Percival, who's the Director of People and Skills at the CBI. Matthew, thanks so much. Why don't we start with you? For those people who've not joined our CBI 10 before, please know that this really is intended to be a conversation. If you've got points, if you've got thoughts, bring them up in the chat and I'll weave them in. But Matthew, why don't you kick off? We want to really focus on new ways of working. But before we do, is there anything, given what we've heard, particularly around international travel at the end of last week, that you think it's worth just updating people on before we get into the main conversation?
Well, thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. As you just said, James, I think the main update since our last webinar is the developments around international travel, dominating the news again this morning with stories of people dashing back to the UK before particularly changes affect travel from Portugal. The CBI has been clear throughout this crisis that the UK mustn't jeopardize the progress that we've been making with the vaccine program, but we've been also very clear that where restrictions continue to prevent sectors from having a route to trade their way to recovery, which is what every business is saying they want to be able to do, and thankfully many more are seeing it as possible to trade their way to recovery right now. International travel is a sector that really is on its knees at the moment. And if they cannot trade their way to recovery through a successful summer season, then government's going to need to think about what greater support it can offer on a sector-specific basis to help them out. So we wouldn't want to jeopardize the recovery and the reopening by doing things that are bad for health and bad for managing the trajectory of the pandemic. But let's make sure we have the support packages in place so that businesses have a viable future. I think the other thing that's going on at the moment is, of course, the questions around the Delta variant, or what used to be called the Indian variant. And we're 2 weeks out from the 21st of June. I don't think we're necessarily a week closer to knowing exactly what's going to happen on the 21st of June. There are a number of unanswered questions still, and this is an area of focus for us, and there's 5 key areas that we're still pushing government for more clarity on behalf of businesses. The first is what's going to be happening with the social distancing guidance, and this is as much about what happens after the 21st of June as what changes on the 21st of June. There's questions around COVID status certificates, the future of the support that's been in place for workplace testing, the trade credit insurance guarantee, and the end of rent protections. They're all key issues that businesses are grappling with at the moment that we're looking to try and get as much certainty as quickly as we possibly can. I'd only say on this point, it's hugely valuable to our work to be able to hear the direct experiences of businesses. So please do keep sending us how these issues are affecting you to our coronavirus support inbox, and it's hugely valuable to our work. Thank you.
Matthew, will you also just help us sort of frame the conversation we're about to have on ways of working? This is an odd one, isn't it? Because actually we're all experimenting and trying to figure out, not just in health terms what works, but in cultural, organization, employment terms, in commercial terms what works. So do you want to just give us a sense of what you're hearing in the CBI? I sort of think of you as a hub for different companies coming in and saying, well, we're trying this and we're trying that. Give us a sense of why we think it's worth coming back to this subject, because we have talked about it before, why you think it's worth us revisiting it.
We have, and I think one of the main things that our members have been saying to us when we're having these conversations with businesses is they're putting an awful lot of effort into trying to design the best first version of this plan that they can, but they've learned so much about remote working through the pandemic. What they haven't learned about is hybrid working. They haven't learned as much about what happens when you try to do certain tasks with some people in a physical location and other people not. And I think they're expecting to learn just as much through the early months of implementing these plans as they learned through the pandemic about the ability to do things in a more distant way. So that means developing the best possible plan first time round, and consulting with staff when you're doing it to try and make sure that you draw on all of the insights and bring people with you through these changes. But if we're going to be testing, learning and refining plans over time, well, that's why we'll keep bringing this back to these webinars, because we'll be hearing businesses raising new questions with us, bringing up new issues and new insights. And it's great to have two different perspectives with us today compared to when we were last talking on this webinar about it. We've had so many different questions, James, that people have been asking us and been telling us that they are thinking about. And if anything, it was difficult for me to try and narrow it down to what would be the couple that I would pick out as key things, just to make sure that businesses don't forget it. So I'm not going to pick the really, really obvious points. I'm going to try and pick a few more of the slightly more obscure ones just to make sure they're on people's radars. And I think the first point is making sure you don't get trapped in a conversation with your workforce exclusively about working from home, because that's not the totality of even flexible working, let alone your employee value proposition. And a number of businesses that are speaking to us are saying they're very alive to the risk that if they only talk about working from home, everybody whose job can't be done from home is excluded from that conversation. And if you're trying to get a single organizational culture and have a compelling value proposition to every one of your employees, then you need to be able to talk about what you're doing in the round that makes your work good work and fair work, and think about flexibility more generally. I mean, that's particularly affecting people we've spent the last year calling key workers. So we absolutely have to have something to say to that part of our workforce too. The second issue I'll mention is the difference between hybrid working and flexible working.
Right.
If the essence of hybrid working is just that we're going to be doing more work from home, I mean, you can see the three of us are all at home at the moment on doing this webinar. There will be more work done from home in the future. But in some workplaces, that's the end of hybrid working. It is just that more work is done from home. There's this question of how much control does an employer give to workers to choose where work is done, or is the employer still deciding whether work is best done for certain tasks and certain days in an office or at home? And I think that's where the difference between formal flexible working and hybrid working kicks in. Some businesses will be able to offer more flexibility to workers to choose where to work than others, and where employers retain control over where work is done, there's a really important role for making sure you're responding to formal flexible working requests properly, because that's the sort of thing that lots of workers are hoping to get from this process, is a greater ability to control where they work, and that might need to be in the form of formal flexible working agreements rather than a general approach to hybrid, depending on how much control each business can cede to its staff. The third thing I'd mention is just around inclusion, and this morning's the start of National Carers Week, so a good time to be reflecting on how your working practices are as inclusive as possible, particularly of people with caring needs. There's lots of opportunities that are widely spoken about in terms of being able to recruit people from groups that you've not been able to recruit as successfully from previously, and improving diversity in your workforce as a result. But there are a few risks around inclusion that businesses are raising with us, because they're telling us they're taking practical steps to try and make sure the risks don't materialize. Because in some workplaces, if you had a culture where, say, presenteeism was used as a proxy by a number of managers for performance, well, that's a real risk in a hybrid working environment. So businesses are doubling down on efforts to try and make sure that they've got a much smarter way of measuring the value that people add, so that you don't get any of the downside risks, where inclusion could be a little bit of a double-edged sword as far as hybrid working goes. But just three thoughts to kick us off, James.
Can I ask you though, just on the second one, Matthew, this point about I think your distinction between hybrid and flexible is massively helpful, right? Because I think we muddle up the two. I think one of the things that you hear a lot from employers is some confusion about what's required of them when it comes to flexibility. What's legally required, and then, if you like, what's culturally expected. In terms of, and I say this as someone who's grown up thinking that you don't necessarily always want to get up in the morning and go to work, right? And I think lots of people know that. Is the expectation in terms of formal flexible work that this is a process, but there's no greater expectation of being able to provide flexibility for workers than there was before the pandemic? In that sense, nothing legal has changed. Is that right?
Well, nothing legal has changed yet. Government is thinking about what it wants to do to implement its manifesto commitment around making flexible working a default. And that's something that's going to be coming this summer. So when government does publish that consultation, we'll be working with our members to respond to it. So if you're out there wondering about the legal side of this, absolutely do work with us in responding to that consultation to government. The legal obligations haven't changed, but many employers were going beyond the legal minimum obligations anyway. It wasn't just, do I offer flexibility when the law requires me to? It was a higher road of, is there an opportunity for me to engage constructively with my workers individually, or with trade unions where we recognise trade unions in our workplace, in order to come to agreements that can be beneficial for us and for them, that afford as much flexibility as possible. And I think one of the things that I'd like to think can happen more often coming out of this crisis is, because businesses have had this mass experiment of work from home if you can, they are better able to articulate, why is it that sometimes some forms of flexibility don't work for us, and we're able to evidence that having tried it, rather than be stuck in the suspicion that when a business says that a certain form of flexibility can't work, they're just not willing to consider it.
And Matthew, how do you do that? Because I think employers are in a very difficult spot here, which is, if you're saying to people who, either for health reasons or just because they've become accustomed to new ways of working, if you're saying to them, actually, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to operate flexibly in the way in which your friends or colleagues are working in different businesses, where do they go to find that evidence that says, actually, in this sector or in this size of business or in this particular industry, flexibility doesn't work? Do you have that kind of information, that kind of research?
Well, I think it's going to be about being able to talk about their experience of the last year. And one of the challenges that you've sort of half mentioned there, that I think it is worth saying a little about, is businesses have gone to such efforts to try and respond to the pandemic in the last year. We've profiled on these webinars before as well, efforts around trying to support health and well-being and things. One of the difficulties will be, if businesses have had all of the data that says actually working in this way has been suboptimal for us in certain bits of the business or in certain tasks and things, the business won't have spent the last year going out of their way to remind staff how unproductive the current working arrangements are, because you're really trying to keep morale up and look after your people. That's been a key characteristic of this recent experience. So it's going to be a bit of a job to do, and it does come down to, how do you have a proper conversation with your workforce about it, to say, we are expecting that there will be more flexibility, and we are expecting there'll be more ability to work from home in the future than there has been in the past. But the future of hybrid working and our new ways of working are likely to be different to what we've done over the last year too.
Yeah.
And some of that transition where the ways of working in the last year have really suited some people, that's got to be a very well and carefully managed conversation between the business, the workers, and where you've got trade unions involved with the trade unions too, to make that work.
But James,
I'm going to come back to you in a second. I'm going to come to Alex Barkley in a moment, but I just want to ask Rebecca Weston about this first, because Rebecca, I think you fit in perfectly into Matthew's first point, which is don't think that everyone's going to be able to work from home. I imagine at Sellafield that is not an option for a very large number of people. So will you just tell us a little bit about what different ways of working, hybrid or flexible, has meant for Sellafield?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James and Matthew, and great to be back here. I think it's about a year since I was here last talking about us putting in place our permanent testing facility at Sellafield, and really concerned then about the safety and security and health and well-being of our workforce, and that trend has really continued through this year. So perhaps very brief context for people who are not familiar with Sellafield, but we're a nuclear operations and waste management and decommissioning business, largely centred at the Sellafield site in West Cumbria, with circa 11,000 employees, and the same again and more in the supply chain supporting that. We operate in the whole range of different environments, from construction sites, lab facilities, factories, nuclear, open air ponds inside caves, and of course offices, and as you can see, at home. Couple of key considerations for us, James, in terms of hybrid and agile, and fundamentally safety, security, protection of the environment's right at the heart of everything we do. And because of that, welfare and well-being of our employees and supply chain colleagues is right in the middle of that. And our challenges over the last year have required us to adapt ionizing radiation regulations, think about how we adapt our compliance with nuclear site license conditions as we need to respond to the issues of the pandemic. And as we continue to develop hybrid and agile working, we continue to make sure that things don't fall between the cracks as we step out of some of those arrangements, and the social distancing approaches and some of those challenges have to be thought through and adapted for our workplace.
And can I just ask you, Rebecca, just practically speaking, you know, when I saw we were speaking this morning, I went on the website last night, and one of the funny things about when you Google Sellafield is, you know, the way Google has the opening hours of every business, right? Yours is open 24 hours, and you've got to be rather relieved that's the case, right, given the business you're in. But it did make me think that, is this a slightly odd conversation to be having given the nature of what Sellafield does, in that presumably your room for maneuver is actually quite limited, that to a large extent you're having to make what you do COVID secure rather than introduce swathes of new ways of working? Or is that the wrong assumption?
It is the wrong assumption, in that we have about 7,000 people working on site. Prior to the pandemic, we had 11,000, and there's a fundamental change for you right off the back. It's actually an acceleration of an opportunity that allows us to keep nuclear site for nuclear operations, and actually really embrace the hybrid and agile working. We're a congested site. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got one of the biggest construction programs in the UK, behind the likes of Crossrail. Over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, we've got to create space and make use of that space. And this has given us an opportunity to do that, but only if we can keep the business connected,
Right.
and the people
Those
operating
4,000.
on the site connected with their designers, with their safety advisors, with their project managers, with pretty much every profession you can think of to support the activities that we do on the site. So that mixed mode of working is a really critical consideration for us. It's not about whether it's remote or in the workplace. It's about how you do all of that, and how you do that in in the mixed modal fashion, and that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges. There's a lot of conversation about one or the other, not
Right.
a lot about blending the two, and that's really where the lead and learn over the next few months comes for us, and managing people's welfare through that with the challenges they've had over the last year, and some of the latent and lasting impacts that I think we don't know about yet, and ensuring that we keep that front and foremost.
For example, Rebecca?
So in terms of, so we've got a cohort of graduates that started in the middle of the pandemic that have only recently sort of, well, not all of them have moved up to the site yet. They've certainly not met physically either their colleagues that they're going to be working with or their sort of cohort of graduates. That's the first time that's happened. We've got a set of apprentices sort of bubbled in their sort of arrangements for the start of their life at Sellafield, but it's some of those. I mean, to use the term of just bumping into people and making new relationships. We've had, I think it's something like 400 people join the business in the last year. Many of those have yet to meet their colleagues actually in person.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, if I might, in a moment. Alex Barkley, I know that you've been waiting patiently. I know people can't see you, but we can, I hope, hear you. Alex, can we?
Probably best.
Yeah, that's Alex. Just will you do us a favour and stand back for a moment, because I guess you get to see at BCG a fair number of different businesses grappling with these issues. Are there yet sort of discernible trends that you see that says, okay, well, I can see the shape of future ways of working?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worth saying. So actually, changes in work have been happening for a while. So to step way back, I mean, 1973, we had the event horizon of the OPEC oil crisis, and people started to, because of the rising prices in oil, petrol being really expensive, workers started to stay home then, as an example. And what we have here is the current event horizon of COVID-19. The virus, which is obviously also causing people to stay home. So there's a kind of, I guess, a macro trend there, which has been in effect enabling the kind of working from home or hybrid working models, and what we would call the distributed organizational model. So not just kind of where you work and so on, but how fundamentally a business is structured and the units are spread. Obviously, this has been enabled by advancements in personal computing, so laptops, mobile phones, and so on, and the advancement of digital connectivity, so broadband and iCloud and what have you. Now, what's been really interesting is seeing, as this has been developing, and actually over many years really, is seeing businesses having to ask similar sorts of questions, but ask them really fast and answer them even more rapidly. So, the kinds of, how can we move forward in these more volatile environments? How can we manage complexity? How can we maintain and develop our competitive edge? How can we build organizational resilience through this particular event and past that? How can we, in effect, build the kinds of workforces and the infrastructure that enables those workforces to perform? And ultimately, how can we innovate to realize value across the markets that we're in? So these kind of broader questions. And I would just point to kind of three things which all connect to what you, James, and you, Rebecca, and Matthew, you were talking about. One is what we're seeing in this kind of rapid, accelerated move because of COVID-19, that event horizon, is a skills shortage. So there's a big skills shortage, and there's a need for specialized skills. This is probably, the hurt is felt probably just very simply in terms of people knowing how to use, for instance, Zoom or a Miro board and so on. But it's also bigger than that. There's a piece in the papers this morning about how businesses are finding it very difficult to access the sorts of skills that they need in order to be able to move forward. So there's a big piece around upskilling and reskilling. And there was a stat as well from, I think, the World Economic Forum, about 1 in 2 workers will need to be reskilled in the next kind of 5 to 8 years. So there's a big kind of train and retain part to it, I think. And we've got some examples. I can talk about some examples inside the Boston Consulting Group where we've been doing that. But I think that's a really, really big and very critical focus to enabling the transitioning as we move, hopefully, away from the current situation. The second point really is what I would call different strokes for different folks. And Rebecca and Matthew, this talks to points that you made, which is really, we're in a situation where possibly because of the skill shortage, possibly because people are more distributed, we've got a situation where workers maybe have a bit more bargaining power. So the employee value proposition, particularly for skilled workers, it's not the same for everybody, but for skilled workers, there is increased bargaining power, and there has been, I think, a kind of a rethinking and a reflection from everything that I've read about what work is and relation to the rest of life as well. And what's great for, let's say, a Gen Z or an iGen or a millennial, is not necessarily great for a Generation Xer, for example. So the compact and the agreements between employers and employees need to become and are becoming more nuanced, I think. So where you work and how you work and who you work with and the types of work that you do, all of that, I think, is in the mix, and so on. And I think on the one hand, there's the kind of the functional part of it, which is the kind of where, how, etc., and the basic needs about being paid for it and feeling safe and what have you. But then there are all of these other factors that are on top of that haven't actually changed. So I think employees, it's kind of saying, what do people really need? Well, they need to feel that there's some autonomy, they're able to achieve their goals, they're able to do interesting work, grow and advance, all of those sorts of things. Actually, that very human stuff, and I am a designer, so I will talk about the human-centeredness of any new kind of employer-employee compacts or agreements that are created. Those things, those basic things, are really important wherever we're working and however we're working and so forth. So that's the second thing. And then obviously the third point here is just about the new ways of working. So these distributed organizational models, which are more collaborative, they are more autonomous, they do have different kind of, I guess, flavors. So the working from anywhere or the working from home compared to the hybrid, working in a particular office location physically and so on, and whilst maybe balancing that out with working from a different location, and the sorts of tools that are connected to that to support that. So Miro, Slack, Jira, and so on. Issues connected to asynchronous working as well.
What does that mean, Alex?
So asynchronous work. So for instance, where you're working in different time zones. Yeah. So for instance, I mean, one of the big things coming through trends-wise is worker well-being and health. So mental and physical health. To be attractive to workers, to retain workers, to maintain workers. They need to feel good about where they're working. So if you're putting people into situations where they're having to get up really early or stay up really late, actually that becomes really tough, and there is this kind of element of burnout that has to be very carefully managed, I think. So my last point here is, I think we're seeing these three big things. They're all impacting on the kind of work experience for employees and employers. And I think that there is this responsibility almost between employers and employees to talk about these factors, talk about these things, be candid about these things. And I think we're seeing that coming through. Certainly we've been running some kind of redesign of or reimagining of work projects inside the Boston Consulting Group and elsewhere. And we're seeing that kind of that candor coming through. So people do seem to be more prepared to talk about these things and to kind of, I guess, employees nuancing what the EVP, the employee value proposition, is in respect of that. So those are.
Can I ask you one thing, Alex, though? Just, I mean, I want to come back to your point about skills, and I'd be interested to hear from Rebecca and Matthew too on this point. But just the one element in this that you didn't touch on is competitiveness. And it's interesting to me that some of the reporting that we've seen, for example, in the financial services industry and banking, has shown a sort of pattern where you hear from Goldman Sachs, you hear from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, a kind of cultural expectation, which is, okay, everyone back to the office. And then you hear from some of the European banks, Paribas, HSBC, etc., which is, well, we're going to take on board more of what you were describing, more of a, let's be more sensitive to the interests of our employees. We think that's going to be culturally better and ultimately economically better. What are you seeing in terms of different patterns around how competitive businesses are going to be depending on how they move to new ways of working?
So I guess my response to that is almost technology is an enabler and a supporter and so on. However, it's always about people. So talent and access to talent is huge. It's huge, and the ability, whether I mean whoever you are really, the ability to upskill or reskill is going to be hugely important in the creation and the maintenance of edge, or competitive edge. Without the talent, that will not be possible to do. So, you could undertake as many kind of resource value realization exercises as you like. So maximizing the potential of your technology or maximizing the potential of other assets that you've got. But without investing in people, it won't really help too much. In most of the markets that we see.
Okay. But Rebecca, do you want to just touch on this question about skills? Because I think that's a really interesting element of this. And it's not as though we haven't been talking about skills in different contexts for some time now, but how do you see new ways of working changing what you need in terms of skills from colleagues and employees?
Yeah, you're right, Alex and James. I mean, it's not a new conversation. Fourth industrial revolution, I think reskilling, upskilling was absolutely on the cards, and like actually quite a lot of things through the pandemic, it's really shone a light on some of that and actually forced an acceleration and a realization of what's required. So again, an opportunity, I guess, to be sought there. But I mean, in terms of a skills shortage, I mean, absolutely. In terms of specialist skills, I think that is going to be a challenge, not just from the pandemic and for us less to do with the kind of agile ways of working. I think that actually creates an opportunity for us with a remote geography. It actually widens the pool in terms of access to those who want to do interesting work but perhaps don't want to move to this part of the world. That's not always been as open a conversation as it certainly is now, both in terms of be that digital specialist, science and engineering, civil projects sort of capabilities, etc. So an advantage there, but there needs to be, given there's a dearth of that across the nation more generally. So yeah, thanks, James.
Matthew, will you just touch on?
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that point, which is there is this idea of talent on the cloud. So we're able to access those specialist skills more broadly across a kind of global skills base. And this is to a point that was made previously, I think, by Matthew. You're kind of alluding to it, which is, and James, you were talking about it as well. There is some catching up to do. So, for instance, being able, let's say, post-Brexit as an example, being able to access those skills, there are some governance and some regulatory challenges that we need to overcome. So where taxable supply might be, let's say in Germany, for instance, who actually benefits from that? And if a person is working in Germany, where do they get taxed from a salary perspective? So the law is kind of a bit like with technology and intellectual property rights and so on. There is quite a bit of catching up to be done. but that's because it's kind of a process of adaptation, I think. So there's some great opportunities, but there's also some watch outs in there as well.
Alex, thank you. Matthew, can I just take you back to your point you made about the consultation over the summer and the shift from, if I understand it correctly, the expectation on employers today to respond to requests for flexible working in a reasonable manner, to the possibility of moving to a world where flexible working is a default, where, and some people you even hear, I know there have been some politicians who've even talked about the right to work from home. What's your read on the direction of public policy on this?
I think sometimes some people are saying things that sound very different, but probably mean some things that are quite similar. So clearly, we're not about, I can't imagine any government trying to create a law that says that Rebecca has to allow people that need to be doing jobs on site for safety reasons, that they have a right to do those jobs from home. That just doesn't work. So that flexibility is not going to be something as blunt as that coming through in legislation. I think the question is going to be more, what responsibilities do businesses have to be able to explain why they are accepting or are rejecting requests from staff, rather than being able to give simpler expectations. So I think businesses probably will need to work a little bit harder in the future than the law required them to, although of course good practice, many of them would have been having these fulsome conversations with staff when these requests come in anyway. So I think that's probably more the direction of travel we're heading in. One of the real difficulties with defining flexible working with a sort of a right to flexible working is the question, what is flexible working? Because to one person, it's being able to vary when you start work. To another person, it's being able to work from home. To another person, maybe it's doing a compressed 4-day week or a job share. It's so many different things that if we were defining exactly what we were giving a people a right to is quite difficult, which is why I think the law has previously tried to focus on making sure that employees have the confidence to ask, and that they're not concerned about being punished for asking, and that employers have the responsibility to respond in a respectful and considered way that actually considers to what extent can we accommodate this in line with still achieving our business objectives. Because to the point you were making earlier on around competitiveness, I don't think that any of those businesses that you were describing have taken an approach where they've thought, one of them's thought, let's go for competitiveness, and the other one's thought, well, let's go thinking about our people. They're just different ideas about how you can realize that competitiveness.
I want to, Rebecca, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Actually, this is for you and for Alex and for Matthew. Because actually the point that Alex kicked off with around skills, and you just picked up on, Rebecca, a number of people have weighed in on the chat, and I just want to play back to you, if I might, 2 different points which speak to the same issue, i.e. how does the funding of reskilling, upskilling work? So Melina Matthews has put in a question that says, do we think that there should be an incentive for businesses to pay for the skills they need in their workforce to get the economy back faster? And Steve Morley, who's the CBM president, has actually raised a similar or related question. If we're going to improve skills, do we need to revamp the apprenticeship levy? Currently, it just doesn't work for businesses, and we also need to review the amount of money which is going to universities for industry on related skills, but which is wasted. We need a mechanism that takes funding direct to industry. So I wondered if I could do this in a sort of 3-part way. Rebecca, to hear in your experience what you think about funding for skills and the apprenticeship levy, and the point that Steve's making around money that goes into the university sector versus direct into industry. I'm going to come to Alex, if I might, just to hear lessons that you may have from BCG about which countries in the world are doing this best and what mechanisms work. And Matthew, what you think the role of the CBI here is trying to join these particular dots. So Rebecca, will you have a go at it first?
I will. There's a big question there, so I'll try and keep that fairly brief. I suppose on a principle level, I think there's a key element about FE and HE really working with employers, thinking about the skills needs, and I think that needs to be further and continue to be encouraged. I'll not offer a particular perspective on the apprenticeship levy, save to say that it does need to work for what we talked about in terms of reskilling and upskilling, not just at the start of the career. We've got some examples where we're using degree apprenticeships to do exactly that in terms of cyber security, control systems, digital skills, project management. But it's not easy, and it's not what it essentially was designed for in some ways. So I think there's some thinking to do about that, where we are going to see careers reskill and upskill and change more than once, many times through somebody's working life, and the industry and education kind of around that needs to be able to support it. That's probably the main point I'll make, James.
Rebecca, thank you. Alex, will you weigh in on this? I mean, and particularly if you've got any examples where you do think other countries in the world have got good models for bringing public funding in to support businesses that are trying to address this skill shortage.
I can't speak to individual examples. However, what I would say is that, you know, we've known for a long while really that the learning and skills agenda is a real challenge. It's a real challenge. But if you look at, let's say, the USA and Silicon Valley as one example of where an amazing amount of activity and kind of edge making went on, and then you look, let's say, at China and their development in AI. Obviously, you've got Silicon Valley, which is, you know, lots of private sector investment funding going into that. China, you know, you've got more government funding and so on going into that. I mean, both countries are world leaders, you know, and they build businesses like Apple, Amazon, etc. You know, others in China from an AI perspective that are hugely present and hugely dominant and kind of dictating terms. Now, you know, to be able to do that, it requires that mixed model of investment, I think, and a joined up strategy which brings together many employees and government and so on, and in fact capital as well, to be able to be able to develop those sorts of skills that we need.
Alex, thank you. Matthew, I'm going to give you the last word, if I might, because I imagine you're sitting there hearing these concerns on the one hand from businesses, you know, a growing policy debate as we hear from politicians. What do you think about how we do address skills as relates to hybrid and flexible working?
I think there's a few things going on. Clearly, there was a big agenda around technology transforming work, creating new skills needs going on pre-pandemic. And we published work last year saying 9 in 10 people in the UK were going to need to learn new skills by 2030. That's not that all of your skills are useless anymore. It's just adding new skills to the skills that you already have. But that would come at an extra cost of £13 billion a year for the next 10 years. And that's a 25% increase on what employers are currently spending on training nationally by the best estimate there is, although these things are a little woolly in the data. At the same time, you've got a government now that has got a skills and post-16 education bill that's currently in the House of Lords that's trying to increase the profile, the relevance, and the quality of education provided through FE and colleges, independent training providers, and the like. But we do still get trapped sometimes in a debate that puts up too many false choices. You know, do we need, as if it's a zero-sum game of, you know, fewer universities, more colleges, or more college, you know, or more universities, fewer colleges. Actually, you've got colleges providing incredibly highly skilled training, and you've got universities playing a really important role in more of the technical education as well, not just the traditional academic 3-year degree. So breaking down those divides and resisting presenting it as a binary one or the other, I think is the way forward on this one. You've heard us say it a number of times before, reform of the apprenticeship levy is a key priority for lots of our members. We do think it's important to unlocking higher levels of business investment into skills by creating a genuine challenge, not just to only invest in skills if it's in the form of an apprenticeship, but actually how do we invest in a broader range of skills, because hybrid working is, for example, going to put very new challenges on a manager. How does a manager run a meeting where they can't rely on the same skill set they had before for chairing a meeting in person? Well, now they've got to chair one that's not even just virtual. They might be needing to chair a meeting that's got some people in person, some people virtually. They're all new skill sets, and there are new skills needs that we're needing to meet to respond to hybrid specifically, as well as the changes that long predate COVID.
Well, Matthew, listen, thank you very much. I'm going to bring things to a close. I don't know sometimes how to sort of think about the new world of our working lives, whether or not we should feel overwhelmed by it or rather invigorated, because suddenly you see businesses, as you describe it, taking on roles that previously they didn't have when it comes to education. I know that the CBI has its net zero conference on Monday. You can see business taking on a whole set of roles around how it addresses the climate emergency. This week, obviously, the big debate around changes in tax and the debate about trying to wrapping our heads around that. I know that my colleague Liz Mosley, we don't have a CBI at 10 this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, we'll be talking about international business travel. And this conversation itself is about the culture of companies as much as anything else. So it feels like there's just a great deal to think and talk about. A big thank you to Alex Barkley from Boston Consulting Group, Rebecca Weston from Sellafield, and you, Matthew Purcell from the CBI. It's been a lot to think about at the start of a Monday morning on this sunny week. I hope everyone has a very good day and a very good week, and look forward to seeing you again at CBI at 10 soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.